At a Douglas County water treatment plant, water courses through a series of outdoor filtering ponds before heading to sinks and toilets in schools, homes, restaurants, and hospitals.
So all of our water comes from the Dog River Reservoir.
Gil Sharaus is the executive director of the Douglas County Water and Sewer Authority. The county is planning a $390 million reservoir expansion to better prepare for droughts.
Droughts are getting worse. They're getting more severe. They're getting more frequent.
But as Douglas County plans for the future, a new kind of business hopes to slurp up gallons upon gallons of that water right now: data centers.
These facilities power everything from AI to email and use huge amounts of water to cool off their constantly running servers.
Those constantly running servers also need power, a lot of it.
And as the industry accelerates, power companies are meeting the demand with fossil fuels.
They've gone from promising to be carbon neutral to really just blowing their goals out of the water.
On today's show, what Georgia's data center boom means for the energy and water supply.
I'm WABE politics reporter Sam Gringlas.
I'm WABE politics reporter Rahul Bali, and this is Plugged In from WABE.
All right, this is part 2 of WAB's deep dive into data centers. The series is called Server South, and you can find the whole project at wabe.org. Last week on the show, we took a close look at what the explosion of data centers means for Georgia's economy and local communities.
So today we're going to dig into the environmental impact, and to kick off that conversation, WABE environment reporter Marisa Mecke joins us. Welcome to the show, Marisa.
Hi, y'all.
So Marisa, explain why data centers need so much water. And I guess, can you just give us a sense of how much water they need?
Yeah, so data center companies use water to cool the big server warehouses, the centers themselves. And there's different systems, some evaporate more water than others. But the short of the long is that the water is kind of like air conditioning for these facilities.
They need to run 24/7, 365.
That's Chris Manganello from the Chattahoochee Riverkeeper. And he says that data centers can use hundreds of thousands to even millions of gallons of water a day, depending on how big the data center is. And it really depends, again, on what kind of system they're using, how big the facility is, and how many computers are running in there. So, for example, Manganello says that one potential project in Coweta County would use up to 9 million gallons of water a day, which is a third of the county's entire daily water intake.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a lot of water. And that number can fluctuate depending on how hot it is outside. But he says he and other water professionals in Georgia are worried about when it's really hot outside.
If all of these large data centers come online and we're in the middle of a drought, it's going to put a lot more stress on the natural river system.
So can companies just use whatever water they need? Is there any state law around, how much water a company can use, especially when it's this much? How does this all work?
This is really a local issue. So when, a company this big wants to make this big of a data center, they do have to give an estimate of how much water they're going to use at a maximum, when it's really hot outside and you're really needing that cooling at its peak. So local water utilities, they have permits themselves that say how much water they're allowed to take out of a river, reservoir or whatever they're using to get water every day. And that's all the water they have for all their users. And so they have to take what the data center tells them and kind of figure that into the calculus of, how do we use all the water we have every day? And beyond that, it's mostly up to the local utility to decide how much water each, person or company gets. And they can choose to give a lot of it to one business if they want, but the trade-off is that they are, going to have less water to give to other businesses or homes or other users.
The concern I have is that the policy environment is not really designed to kind of respond to this new unprecedented demand.
Manganello says a lot of localities and the state as a whole haven't really coordinated on just how much water is being taken out of the river systems by data centers. And he says there also hasn't been a coordinated effort really yet to revisit drought plans to factor in those data centers. Part of what data centers are looking for location-wise isn't just proximity to electrical infrastructure, which Emily will tell you all about, or cheap land. They're also shopping around for who will give them the amount of water they actually need. But throughout whole watersheds like the Chattahoochee River, which Manganello works in, there are groups that are looking in to coordinate how much water is being used across cities and counties. If we think back to the Georgia water wars, downstream communities were, beefing. They were arguing that Georgia and Atlanta particularly were using too much water, and data centers could have a role to play in that.
Water wars. I have not heard anyone talk about water wars in a minute.
It starts back in the 90s, so I've lived only really in a water wars reality in Georgia. But you might have also heard it called the Tri-State Water Wars. So Georgia, Alabama, and Florida, we all share a bunch of different waterways. The Apalachicola Chattahoochee Flint River Basin, and Georgia and Alabama also share the Alabama-Coosa-Tallapoosa River Basin. And so people downstream from us have argued that Georgia is using too much of that water, and that has led to a lot of court cases, some of which Georgia has won, even some, recently. And, those court cases are all about how much water that we can take and from where.
Okay, so to turn back to the data centers and their use of water, I wonder, is there a policy solution here? What's been studied?
They're not new, but the abundance of them in Georgia is still kind of a relatively new phenomena and is growing. And so state lawmakers are really just beginning to study the issue of water in data centers, but the Atlanta Regional Commission is collecting information on data centers and water usage. Danny Johnson at the ARC says his organization is working on encouraging local governments and utilities to communicate and talk to each other early during permitting.
They do have options, but they just need to understand what those options are early in the process.
Although it might be more expensive for developers, local governments could be encouraging them to use more water-efficient cooling methods.
What are some of the other potential solutions in terms of technology or even collaboration?
So in Douglas County, when I talked to Gil Sharaus there, he says that his water authority has actually been using one solution for a Google data center for, a while.
For about 15, 16, I'll say 17 or 18 years.
Sharaus says usually once the county treats wastewater, which is like, the sewage, the stuff you flush down toilets, it puts the clean water back into the environment to, flow on downstream. But instead, for the Google facility,
we developed a separate treatment system at one of our wastewater treatment plants to deliver cooling water specifically for that partner.
He says they found a happy medium. The water from the data center, it doesn't get the full drinking water treatment that requires more time, energy, and resources.
We call it using the best water for their need.
But Sharaus says this solution hasn't really caught on statewide, and Douglas County hasn't had any other data centers as big as Google that have needed a similar solution. But he says that the county could expand on this wastewater strategy in the future as they have more data centers and other big water users, maybe not necessarily a data center, that are also shopping around for, water and for building in Douglas County. But, lots of folks, including businesses paying for energy and water for cooling, they do want to see more innovative solutions. But it'll be a question of if the market, utilities, or regulations, drive them to actually do it.
So then what are the implications for places that maybe haven't developed an innovative workaround solution if this issue isn't addressed on a larger scale? I mean, I imagine water shortages and drought are only going to become more prevalent with climate change, right?
Yeah. So like we said, Sharaus said his utility is doing a major upgrade of its reservoir, and he said that was mainly to prepare for any possible future droughts. He says in his experience in Douglas County, droughts have been getting worse and they've been getting more frequent, and, the county needs more capacity. It's necessary to make sure that, they can weather the hot weather, if you know what I mean. And, for a lot of utilities, if they don't address their drought priorities, meaning, who gets what water when it gets hot and dry outside, and if they don't figure out where data centers really lie in that lineup, it could cause conflict or problems during a water emergency. Because again, data centers have to have cooling and they'll fry if they don't. But in the meantime, and during, not drought times, it means utilities are going to have to make tough decisions. Is it worth spending a lot of your water capacity on a data center? And that's also a decision that utilities, residents, and leaders are going to have to engage in their own communities too. So there's also going to be some conflict about, what kinds of development do we really want to incentivize in our neighborhoods?
And I want to go back to the cost of all of this. And another challenge that local governments are facing while data centers are moving in is governments are losing part of one possible revenue stream to pay for all this. The two main tax breaks for data centers not only exempt sales taxes that go to the state of Georgia, but also to local governments as well. The state of Georgia is projecting that local governments will lose about $150 million in sales taxes in the 2026 budget year. That's the budget year that starts July 1st. Republican State Senator Chuck Hufstetler, he's the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, which oversees taxes and tax credits. He's worried about what this means for upgrading water systems.
If they weren't giving away that sales tax exemption, which the state doesn't give them any choice on, they have to give that exemption, they could be using that money to improve the water system, to have the capacity for these facilities and, hopefully upgrade the system for everybody. So the subsidies are just, in my opinion, totally unnecessary and need to be taken away. And we can turn this into a positive thing for everybody if we'll do this right.
Now, Hufstetler points out that there is other revenues coming in from these data centers, for example, franchise fees and property taxes.
Marisa, what are you following with this story going forward?
I'm going to be following regional water planning groups to see how the state utilities are thinking of this problem together. And I'm also going to be following other water professionals and groups that, again, are trying to coordinate because our water resources cross, a lot of places. The rivers don't know where county lines are. So I'm really focused on this question of coordinating across, city, county utility lines.
WABE environment reporter Marisa Mecke, thank you so much for sharing your reporting with us.
Anytime. Thank y'all for having me.
We'll be right back. This is Plugged In from WABE. Welcome back to Plugged In from WABE. We're now going to look at what data centers mean for energy production in Georgia.
To do that, we're joined by Emily Jones, climate reporter for WABE and Grist. Welcome back to the show, Emily.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, Emily, your reporting starts in a really interesting place, and I think this scene really brings the topic to life. So maybe can you set it up a little bit, and then let's take a listen.
Sure. So I started out with a long drive right to the very center of Georgia in Lee County. And our WABE's photographer and I drove our Subarus down this long dirt road.
This is a flock of sheep with a job to do: eat grass.
Our spec is has to be at least 24 inches and below.
Tyler Huber is the shepherd charged with managing and caring for the sheep on an expansive site in Lee County in southwest Georgia.
My rule of thumb is if I can walk out here and among the panels and still see my boots, then that's effective, grazing management.
Shiny solar panels cover this land, providing shade and shelter for the sheep. The flock, in turn, keeps the grass chewed or trampled so it doesn't interfere with the production of energy. This modern pastoral scene serves a high-tech purpose, powering Meta's data center complex in Social Circle, east of Atlanta.
Not that I'm a sheepish person when I'm asking a question, but you talked to the folks who partnered with Meta to build this site. Talk about kind of this promise of collaboration.
This whole thing came about because Meta has a goal of net zero emissions. So when they announced this data center back in 2018, they promised that they were going to power it totally with solar energy. So here's Matt Beasley from Silicon Ranch, which is Meta's solar partner.
We now have 11 projects with them in the state of Georgia. We've built 9 of them.
But the thing is, now that data centers have exploded into this boom industry, solar is not the only new energy getting built anymore.
Okay, so what is getting built?
Well, most notably and controversially, oil and gas-fired electric turbines. Georgia Power made this highly unusual emergency request for power a couple years ago because the new demand that they were projecting from data centers was so high. So now we have new fossil fuel turbines being built in Georgia for the first time in years, and this trend is continuing. Georgia Power is now asking to keep coal plants open longer than they had planned to, and the electric co-ops, which are, sort of the other power providers in the state, are also adding non-renewable power for data centers as well. And I should say that all of those utilities are also still adding solar and batteries and other renewables, but this influx of fossil fuels is a really huge shift for the tech companies who are building the data centers because most of them have clean energy goals. So I talked with Alex Hanna from the Distributed AI Research Institute about this.
They've gone from promising to be carbon neutral to really just blowing their goals out of the water.
So it's talked about throughout our series Server South, but why is this data boom happening and why do these facilities require so much power?
Alex Hanna can offer the best answer for that as well.
This is uniquely due to AI and generative AI in particular.
I was honestly really struck by how unequivocal everybody that I spoke to for this story was about this, from AI skeptics like Hannah to the data center companies themselves. It's just a fact. Generative AI like ChatGPT just takes so much more computation than regular computing, like sending an email or even the video chat that we're using right now to record this podcast. So the more computing that goes into generative AI also means more energy. They require more energy to do all those millions of essentially math problems that the computer chips are doing. So the new data centers that they're building to serve AI need 5 to 10 times as much power as the data centers that were being built even just a few years ago.
You know, Emily, I remember hearing a story on NPR, and it quoted a Goldman Sachs report that said a single ChatGPT search needs nearly 10 times the electricity of like a Google search you and I do. So really, what are the implications of all this energy use, especially when it's not green energy?
Well, the implications, not to sound too drastic, are genuinely the future of the planet. So right now, we're in a moment where scientists across the board agree that we need to cut carbon emissions drastically and immediately to combat climate change. And progress is not happening on that as quickly as the research shows is needed. But some change has sort of gradually been happening. You know, we've seen more solar added, we've seen more EVs, all of that kind of thing. And the net zero pledges that these tech companies and utilities, including Georgia Power's parent company, have made are all part of that. But now there's this rush to power data centers by any means necessary. And it has the utilities that promise to close coal plants suddenly asking to keep them open. It has them building new fossil fuel plants. It has tech companies extending their self-imposed deadlines for net zero, saying maybe it's going to take us another decade, another 15 years past what we said before. I should note, as I say that, though, that Meta did tell me that their net zero pledge hasn't changed. But some tech companies have sort of extended their pledges. And so climate advocates are looking at all of this, and they argue that it's a big step in the wrong direction for carbon emissions and for climate change.
So, Emily, we started off talking about a potential solution with that solar field for Meta. Can these types of projects be scaled up? And I guess what is challenging about meeting the green energy demand right now?
That's kind of the billion-dollar question at the moment, and it's complicated. Solar can be tough even when you pair it with batteries because it is intermittent, meaning it doesn't make power overnight when it's cloudy. And then the massive power needs of these new AI data centers are also kind of overwhelming the solar that we have right now. So the conversation around energy and data centers has kind of shifted to this notion of flexibility, which is the idea that with the right incentives, you can get data centers to do most of their work and therefore use most of their energy at times when most people aren't using much energy. So again, maybe overnight. And that way it wouldn't strain the grid quite as much. But I've also heard some serious skepticism about how well you can actually get those incentives to work in practice. And then the other issue here is speed. A big part of the reason that Georgia Power and the other utilities are falling back on fossil fuels at the moment is that the energy demand they're forecasting from data centers is not just high, it's supposed to come really soon, like in the next couple of years. But experts have raised some pretty serious questions about the Georgia Power forecast. And if, as the critics argue, the actual demand turns out to be lower or comes on more slowly, then maybe there could be time to pursue other solutions other than fossil fuels.
So, Emily, is there a place for policy in all of this?
Oh, absolutely. From the energy side, just one example, the Georgia Public Service Commission, as we speak, is considering what version of that data center energy forecast they believe, and therefore what to allow Georgia Power to do as a result. So it's certainly complicated, especially since this is such a new emerging industry, but policymakers have a lot of options and a lot of tools in their hands right now.
You know, the State House Special Committee on Resource Management has been meeting to talk about some of these issues. I chatted with the committee's chair, Republican State Representative Brad Thomas.
There are some places where data centers do really make sense, but I'm also concerned that by data centers coming in, if they're picking up all this load, that it's going to get passed on to the ratepayer, and I'm just not sure how we're going to get to the point where I feel like that balance has been achieved.
The concerns over the cost of electricity and water infrastructure because of data centers is a concern you're increasingly hearing from more policymakers.
Emily Jones, climate reporter for Grist and WABE. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And you can find the whole Server South series at wabe.org/server-south.
Before we go, we should note a big story we'll be watching in the coming days: protest against the Trump administration's immigration crackdown that have been spreading around the country, and President Donald Trump deploying the Marines to Los Angeles to quell them.
More protests are expected on Saturday, including in Metro Atlanta, tied to the massive military parade Trump is planning in D.C. Republican Governor Brian Kemp says Georgia's state and local law enforcement are ready to, quote, take whatever appropriate action is needed. Brookhaven police arrested 6 people and deployed tear gas after a demonstration Tuesday night on Buford Highway. Police said the situation devolved after an earlier peaceful protest. In a post on social media, Kemp emphasized the constitutional right to peaceful protest, but wrote that violence against law enforcement officers will be met with, quote, quick and heavy accountability. Attorney General Chris Carr said the state would not hesitate to bring domestic terrorism charges for, quote, those who earn it. The ACLU of Georgia's Christopher Bruce said the threat of domestic terrorism charges should not be used to, quote, discourage people from engaging in political protest and exercising their First Amendment rights.
You can follow this story throughout the weekend at WABE.org, where you'll also find coverage of some of the other big politics stories we've been following, including the Georgia GOP convention and the Georgia Supreme Court striking down 4 controversial state election board rules.
That's it for this edition of Plugged In.
Plugged In is produced by Brendan Rivers. Our managing editor is Alex Helmick.
Plugged In is available wherever you want to listen. If you listen on demand, make sure to head on over to the Plugged In feed to subscribe and leave us a rating.
You can also find us on the radio at 90.1 every Friday morning from 9:30 to 10.
And remember, as public media faces an uncertain funding stream, you can support this work with a gift at wabe.org/donate. I'm WABE politics reporter Sam Gringlas.
I'm WABE politics reporter Rahul Bali. We'll be back next week.